She was running. Not the kind of running that comes from exercise or urgency or a schedule that's fallen behind. The kind of running that comes from the specific, bone-deep knowledge that if you stop, something worse than exhaustion is waiting for you on the other side of that decision. Her feet hit the wet stone of the alley without rhythm, without strategy, driven by nothing more sophisticated than the oldest instruction the body knows. Move. Keep moving. Do not stop. The alley was narrow. The walls on either side were close enough to touch with both hands if she stretched her arms out, which she did not, because her arms were busy keeping her upright as she turned the corner and hit the dead end and understood, in the single worst second of an already terrible night, that she had run herself into a trap of her own making. Behind her, the entrance to the alley. Ahead of her, a wall. And between her and the wall, sitting on the ground with his back against the stone and his legs stretched out in front of him like a man with absolutely no pressing concerns, was a stranger. Filthy. Ragged. Wearing clothes that had been through more weather than any single garment should be asked to survive. His hands were resting on his knees and his head was slightly tilted, and he was looking at her with an expression that was neither alarm nor curiosity, nor the particular wariness of someone who understands that a panicked woman appearing in a dead-end alley at night means trouble is close behind her. He was simply looking at her. Calm. Present. Completely, incomprehensibly unbothered. She heard the footsteps before she could think. Heavy boots on wet stone, coming fast, coming certain, coming with the rhythm of someone who already knows where they're going and has decided the outcome in advance. She heard the sound of his breathing before she could see him. She heard the sound of her own heartbeat louder than either of those things. And she did the only thing she could think of. She crossed the alley in 4 steps, dropped to her knees in front of the stranger, took his face in both of her hands, and kissed him. His lips were dry. His jaw was still. He did not recoil, did not grab her, did not make a single sound. He sat there, and he let her do it, and for 3 full seconds the alley contained nothing except the rain and the footsteps getting closer and the impossible stillness of a man who had apparently decided that a stranger kissing him in the dark was not on the list of things worth reacting to, particularly high. She kept her eyes open. She needed to see the entrance. She needed to know the moment Damon Vark came around that corner, needed to know if the misdirection had worked, needed to know if she had bought herself the 10 seconds she was asking for. She got what she needed. Damon Vark came around the corner, stopped, and saw them. His eyes went the particular shade of black that they went when his authority was being questioned. His hands closed into fists at his sides. His chest expanded with a breath that was not quite a breath, more a recalibration, the body of a dominant wolf absorbing an unexpected input and deciding what to do with it. She felt the stranger's eyes move. She was still close enough to feel the shift, the slight adjustment of his focus from wherever it had been to the man standing at the entrance of the alley. She pulled back just far enough to see his face. He was looking at Damon Vark. And he was smiling. Not a nervous smile. Not a placating smile. Not the kind of smile that says, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause a problem, please don't hurt me." The kind of smile that belongs to someone who is watching a situation unfold exactly the way they expected it to and finding the confirmation of their expectations quietly, privately satisfying. Damon Vark stared at them for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back around the corner. His footsteps receded into the rain and the dark and the distance and eventually disappeared entirely. She would tell us, much later, that she almost didn't notice any of that. That her attention had gone somewhere else entirely in the moment the stranger's face came back into focus. That her body had done something in those 3 seconds that she could not explain and could not undo and could not file neatly into any category of experience she had accumulated across 20 years of a life that had not been particularly gentle with her. She told us that he smelled like something she had no name for. Then we will pause here and come back to that, because before we go any further, this channel needs you. If you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, because this story is only just beginning and you do not want to miss a single second of what comes next. Subscribe now. We are continuing. Lyra Voss was born into the Crestfall Pack on a winter morning 20 years before any of this happened, and from the first day she was old enough to understand what rank meant, she understood that she did not have one worth mentioning. The pack hierarchy was not a metaphor or a suggestion or a social convention that people observed when it was convenient. It was the structure of the world she lived in, as fixed and as non-negotiable as the ground beneath her feet. At the top sat the Alpha, whose authority was absolute and whose word was the closest thing to law that the pack recognized. Below the Alpha, the Betas, who carried that authority outward into the daily life of the pack, enforcing it, embodying it, reminding everyone below them that the order of things existed for a reason, and that the reason did not require their agreement. Below the Betas, the mid-ranks, who had enough standing to live comfortably and enough sense to be grateful for it. And at the bottom, absorbing everything the ranks above them needed somewhere to put, doing every task no one else wanted, occupying the edges of every room and the margins of every conversation, were the Omegas. Lyra had been assigned Omega rank at 8 years old, at the ceremony where the pack's young were formally placed into the hierarchy based on the assessment of the senior wolves. She remembered standing in the line of children and watching the ones ahead of her receive their assignments and walk to the appropriate section of the gathered pack with expressions ranging from pride to relief to the careful neutrality of someone who had been told to be grateful for whatever they received. She remembered when her name was called. She remembered the pause before the senior wolf spoke the word. She remembered understanding, in that pause, that the word coming was not one of the good ones. She had been Omega for 12 years. In those 12 years, she had learned every inch of the compound the way a person learns a space they will never be allowed to leave. She had learned which floorboards announced themselves under a footstep and which were silent. She had learned which hours of the day were safest to move through the main areas and which hours it was better to find tasks in the outer buildings where the senior wolves rarely came. She had learned how to carry herself in a way that took up as little space as possible, how to complete her work without drawing attention to it, how to be present and invisible at the same time, which is a skill that sounds impossible until you have spent enough years practicing it under the instruction of necessity. She had never had an ally. Not a real one. There had been a woman, years ago, one of the older Omegas, who had shown her small kindnesses in the way of extra food and the occasional warning when a particular Beta was in a difficult mood. But the woman had left the pack through a mating bond that took her to a territory 3 days' travel away, and after she left there was simply no one. Lyra had learned to be her own resource, to solve her own problems, to navigate the specific, grinding difficulty of her daily life using only the tools that the daily life itself had given her, which were observation, patience, and a quality of endurance that she herself would not have called strength, but that was functionally indistinguishable from it. She was not naive. She was not broken. She was not waiting to be rescued, because she had lived long enough in the real mechanics of the world she occupied to understand that rescue was a concept that applied to people the pack considered worth rescuing, and the pack's position on that question, where Lyra Voss was concerned, had been made consistently clear. She had made her peace with that. Or something close enough to peace that the difference was not worth examining too carefully. And then the moon goddess had made her decision. The fated mate ceremony happened 3 times a year, when the pack gathered at the central grounds and the bonds that the moon goddess had assigned were revealed. It was taken seriously. Even among wolves who were skeptical of the more ceremonial aspects of their culture, the mate bond was not something people dismissed, because the mate bond was not symbolic. It was physical, biochemical, as real and as undeniable as any other fact of the body. When your fated mate was in the room, you knew. When they were close, you felt it. When you acknowledged the bond formally, it began the process of sealing itself into both of you in ways that could not be reversed without cost. Lyra had stood at every mate ceremony since she was old enough to attend and had watched other wolves find their bonds and had felt nothing. Not resentment, particularly. More a kind of quiet acknowledgement that the moon goddess was, apparently, taking her time in Lyra's case, and Lyra was not in a position to rush anyone. At the ceremony 6 days before the night in the alley, that changed. She felt it the moment Damon Vark entered the grounds. A pull. A recognition. The specific, involuntary response of a body that has just located the thing it was made to locate, and is reporting this information with the excitement of someone who has been waiting a very long time and does not yet know that the thing they found is going to be a problem. She had looked at him across the gathered pack and felt the pull and known, with the particular certainty of a bond establishing itself, that she was looking at her fated mate. And in the same second she felt the pull, she saw his face register it too. Saw him look in her direction. Saw his eyes find her. Watched the sequence of expressions that moved across his face in the span of 2 seconds, recognition, calculation, and then something that settled into his features like a verdict that had already been delivered and was simply waiting to be announced. He walked to the front of the grounds. He said her name. He said he did not accept the bond. He said that no beta of his standing would enter a mate bond with an omega. He said it clearly and without particular cruelty, which in some ways was worse than cruelty, because cruelty at least implies that the other person is worth the emotional expenditure. His tone was the tone of a man correcting an administrative error. Informing the relevant parties. Moving on. The pack heard it. Lyra stood where she was and let the words land and did what she always did, which was to absorb the impact without showing anyone where it hit. She nodded once. She walked back to the edge of the grounds. She spent the rest of that day working. She had told herself it was fine. She had told herself that a rejection from Damon Vark was, in practical terms, not the worst outcome. She had told herself that she had survived worse, and that this was simply one more thing to fold into the existing architecture of her life and move forward. What she had not accounted for was the calculation Damon made in the 4 days that followed. He came to her on the 5th morning after the rejection. She was carrying water from the eastern well to the kitchens, a walk she made 6 times before the pack's breakfast was prepared. He fell into step beside her without announcing himself, and she felt the bonds pull even through the fact of the rejection, which was one of the more uncomfortable experiences the body is capable of delivering. And she kept walking and kept her eyes forward and waited. He told her that while he did not accept the bond as a mating bond, he had determined that the moon goddess's connection between them gave him a claim of another kind. She worked for him now, not as a mate. As an extension of his household. She would take on additional responsibilities under his direction. She would be available when he required assistance. She would operate, in all practical terms, as belonging to his authority, because the bond, whatever its intended form, had established a connection, and he intended to use that connection in the way that was most useful to him. He said all of this in the same tone he had used at the ceremony. Administrative. Certain. As though it had already been decided, and this was simply the notification. She said nothing because she was doing the rapid, experienced calculation of someone who has spent years assessing which battles are survivable and which are not. She looked at his rank, his standing, the size of the gap between his authority and hers, and she arrived at the conclusion she always arrived at in these situations, which was that the response that kept her safest in the immediate term was silence. He took the silence as agreement and walked away. She stood at the well with her water containers and stared at nothing for a long moment, and then she began, very quietly and very carefully, to think about her options. She had very few. She spent 3 days examining them from every angle she could find, and she kept arriving at the same answer, which was that staying was not survivable and leaving was not permitted. Wolves did not leave their packs without formal release from the Alpha, and Lyra had no leverage with Alpha Garrett and no relationship with him that would make such a request anything other than a humiliation she could not afford. Running without release meant being classified as a rogue, which carried its own set of consequences in a world where an unaffiliated wolf was vulnerable in ways that made her current situation look comfortable by comparison. She was in a structure that had no door. On the 6th night, Damon Vark told her that she would begin her new responsibilities the following morning. That she would move her belongings from her current quarters to a room in the service wing adjacent to his household's buildings. That this was happening whether she agreed to it or not, and that her agreement was not, in fact, something he was asking for. She told him she understood. She waited until he left. And then she ran. She had no plan beyond the running. She had no destination, no contact, no safe location waiting for her at the end of whatever path she was on. She simply needed to not be where she was, and she needed the space that running created, and she needed 10 more seconds than she currently had. And she was still making the calculation of what came after those 10 seconds when she turned the corner of the alley and found the dead end and the stranger. After Damon Vark disappeared back around the corner, and the alley went quiet, and the stranger's smile faded back into that settled, unreadable expression, Lyra sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time. He was not as old as his circumstances suggested. The dirt and the torn clothing and the way he had been sitting on the ground had created an impression of someone outside time, someone whose age was irrelevant because their circumstances had removed them from the ordinary progression of a life with landmarks. But looking at him directly, she could see that he was young. Late 20s maybe. Strong in a way that his posture chose not to advertise. His face was the kind of face that would have been remarkable in better light and cleaner conditions, structured in a way that suggested someone had taken the construction of it very seriously. His eyes were the color of amber in the dark. She opened her mouth to say something. She did not know what. Thank you seemed insufficient and strange. An apology for the kiss seemed like the wrong register given that he had not objected to it, and she had not exactly had the luxury of asking permission. An explanation for why she had done it seemed like a conversation she did not have the energy for in that particular moment. Before she could decide, he was moving. He stood up. Not quickly, not with the energy of someone who has been waiting to act. Slowly, with the unhurried ease of someone who rises when they choose to rise and not before. He was taller standing than she had estimated him to be sitting. He reached into the pocket of his coat, and he took something out, and he set it on the ground where he had been sitting. Then he walked past her toward the entrance of the alley, not brushing her, not acknowledging her, not producing a single word or gesture that would have made the moment feel resolved. She heard his footsteps on the wet stone for a few seconds, and then she did not hear them anymore. She turned and looked at what he had left. A ring. Single band. Black metal, no stone, no visible marking. Small enough to fit a finger, but heavy in the way that things made with intention rather than convenience are heavy. She crossed to it and crouched down and picked it up, and the moment it sat in her palm she understood that something was wrong with what she was holding. Wrong in the specific way of a thing that is out of place so completely that its presence in this location rewrites the logic of the location itself. The scent coming off it was not the scent of a beggar. It was not the scent of poverty or road or weather or any of the things that should have been on a ring left by a man who had been sitting in a filthy alley in the rain. It was clean and deep and old in a way that scents are not old, and layered underneath the cleanliness of it was a power signature that made every trained instinct she had stand at attention. She had been an Omega for 12 years. She had spent 12 years around wolves of every rank in the Crestfall Pack, learning the scent signatures of authority the way you learn a language when you live inside it. She knew what a beta smelled like. She knew what the alpha smelled like. She knew the signature of rank in the way that people who have no rank of their own develop an acute sensitivity to it, because their survival depends on reading it correctly. What she was holding did not smell like any of those things. It smelled like something above all of those things. It smelled like the kind of authority that the ranks she knew were themselves accountable to. She stood in the alley with the ring in her palm, and the rain coming down and the echo of footsteps that had already gone silent, and she looked at the band in the low light, and she turned it, and on the inside of the band, barely visible, pressed into the metal in a way that suggested it had been put there not as decoration, but as identification, was the outline of a crown. She knew, from the compound's announcement 3 days ago, that a delegation of significant and unnamed authority was expected to arrive at the Crestfall Pack within the week. She knew that the senior wolves had prepared the formal guest quarters and had spoken about it in the low, careful voices reserved for information that carried weight. She knew that the deliberate absence of a name in the announcement was itself a kind of communication, a signal that the identity of the arriving party was already understood by those who needed to understand it, and that the rest of the pack would be told what they needed to know when they needed to know it. She knew all of this. And she was standing in an alley holding a ring with a crown on it, which had been left on the ground by a man in torn clothing, who had not flinched when a dominant beta wolf had appeared 10 feet away from him, who had sat in the rain without seeking shelter as though the rain did not apply to him, who had smiled at Damon Vark the way a person smiles at something that is, relative to the scale of their actual concerns, very small. She held the ring for a long time. The rain kept falling. The alley stayed empty. And somewhere beyond the compound walls, in a direction she could not identify and at a distance she could not estimate, the scent from the ring continued to exist in her memory with the particular persistence of something her body had decided to hold on to regardless of what her mind chose to do with it. She would go back to her quarters that night, and she would not sleep, and she would lie on her narrow bed in the low structure at the edge of the compound with the ring closed in her fist, and she would think about the man's eyes in the dark and the fact that he had not stood up until he was ready, and she would understand, with the part of herself that had been doing the real work of reading the world her entire life, that she had not been the one doing the rescuing in that alley. She had been the one who ran into an alley looking for 10 seconds, and had been given something she did not yet have a name for. She did not know what it was yet. She did not know who he was. She did not know that in 3 days the Crestfall Pack would be standing in formal assembly in the central grounds, and that everything she understood about her place in the world would cease to be accurate. She knew one thing. Alpha-level scent. On a ring left by a beggar. In an alley at the edge of mid-tier pack territory on a rainy night when the whole world was supposed to be quiet. Something was off. Something was very, very off. And she was going to find out what it was, or she was going to come apart trying. The morning after the alley, the compound woke up the way it always woke up. The senior wolves moved through the main areas with the particular purposefulness of people who have authority and enjoy using it early. The mid-ranks went about their routines with the comfortable efficiency of people who know where they stand and have made their peace with it. The Omegas were already working before anyone else needed to be awake, having learned that the earlier you completed your tasks, the less supervision you attracted, and the less supervision you attracted, the more of the day belonged to you in any meaningful sense. Lyra was at the eastern well before dawn. She had not slept. Her eyes were steady, but there was a quality behind them that sleep would have softened and its absence had left sharp. She moved through her morning tasks with the same mechanical precision she always brought to them, and no one who watched her would have seen anything different. She was good at that. She had been good at that for a long time. The ring was in the inner pocket of her jacket, sewn into the lining at a seam she had unpicked and repaired years ago for exactly this kind of storage. She had put it there before dawn, and she had not taken it out, and she had not looked at it again, but she was aware of it with every step she took in a way that made it very difficult to think about anything else. She was at the water storage building, her third trip of the morning, when she heard the conversation. 2 of the pack's senior betas, standing in the narrow corridor between the storage building and the main kitchen block, speaking in voices pitched low enough to signal that the conversation was not for general circulation. She was behind them and around the corner and moving quietly, which meant they did not know she was there, which meant they did not adjust their volume the way people adjust their volume when they remember that Omegas are always closer than you think. She did not slow down. She kept her pace exactly as it was. But her hearing sharpened in the involuntary way of someone whose body has been trained by years of receiving critical information from the margins of rooms and the edges of corridors, and she caught the words as she passed. Not all of them. Enough. The delegation. Already here. Arrived last night. Not through the front entrance, not with formal announcement, not with the advance notice that the compound had been preparing for. Just here. Quietly. Without ceremony. And the alpha had been notified privately, and the senior betas had been notified privately, and the information was moving through the upper ranks in the careful, controlled way of something too significant to mishandle. She turned another corner and kept walking, and did not change her expression, and filed the information into the part of her mind where the important things went, the part that had been continuously maintaining a picture of the world around her since she was 8 years old, and learned that the picture was the only tool she reliably had. The delegation had arrived last night. She thought about the alley. She thought about the rain. She thought about a man sitting on the ground in torn clothing with the patience of someone who has nowhere pressing to be, and the absolute physical stillness of someone who has never in their life had to demonstrate their authority through posture, because their authority requires no demonstration. She thought about the ring in her pocket. She made herself stop thinking about it, because she was approaching the main kitchen, and there were people in it, and she needed her face to be doing nothing interesting. She delivered the water. She went back to the well. She made the remaining trips. She completed the morning's work and moved into the afternoon's tasks and moved through the compound with the practiced invisibility of someone who had been invisible so long that the invisibility itself had stopped feeling like a loss and had started feeling simply like the conditions of her particular life. Damon Vark found her in the late afternoon. He was standing at the entrance to the outer courtyard where she had been stacking the split wood that had been delivered that morning, and he was watching her work with the expression he had been wearing increasingly often in the past week, which was the expression of a man who has decided how a situation ends and is simply waiting for the situation to agree with his conclusion. She saw him from across the courtyard, and she continued stacking, and she did not look at him again. He crossed to her. He stopped 2 feet away. He told her that he had given her adequate time to process the transition in her responsibilities, and that he expected her to present herself at his household building tomorrow morning to begin her new duties. He told her that the room in the service wing had been prepared and that she should move her belongings this evening. He told her that she should not mistake his patience for flexibility, because it was not flexibility. It was simply a timeline, and the timeline was now concluded. She stacked another piece of wood. She said she understood. He stood there for a moment longer than was necessary, which was the thing he did when he wanted to be certain that the weight of the conversation had been felt. Then he turned and walked back across the courtyard. She watched him go. She stacked 2 more pieces of wood. Then she set down the piece she was holding, and she stood very still for a moment, and she looked at the ground, and she thought about the ring in her pocket, and the scent on it, and the calm amber eyes of a man who had smiled at Damon Vark the way you smile at something that cannot reach you. She made a decision. Not a plan. She still did not have a plan, but a direction. A point toward which she was going to move and figure out the rest as she moved. She was going to find the stranger. She spent the evening completing her assigned tasks and making no unusual movements and saying nothing to anyone. She moved through the compound with the clean, unremarkable efficiency of someone whose interior life was entirely invisible to the people around her, which it always was, which was sometimes the only advantage she had. After the compound settled into its nighttime routines and the lights in the main buildings went down and the change of the watch guard brought a brief period of distraction to the perimeter, she slipped out. She went back to the alley first, because it was the only starting point she had. She stood where the stranger had been sitting, and she looked at the walls and the ground, and she did not find anything she did not already know. She went to the area around the compound's outer edges, moving in a slow arc, using the scent she had memorized from the ring to try to locate a thread of it in the night air. She found it on the second circuit. Faint. Recent. Moving in the direction of the older buildings at the north end of the compound, the ones that had been formally closed for the past decade after the previous Alpha's household had moved to the central structure. The ones that had been reopened and cleaned 3 days ago in preparation for the incoming delegation's arrival. She followed it. She was careful. She stayed in the shadows at the edge of the buildings, and she moved without sound, and she used every skill she had accumulated across a lifetime of navigating spaces where she was not particularly welcome. She followed the scent to the largest of the north buildings, the one that in the previous generation had been the main gathering hall for formal events, now converted into guest quarters for visitors of significance. She did not go in. She stood outside and she listened. Silence. She was preparing to circle the building when the door opened. She pulled back into the shadow of the wall so fast and so completely that if you had been standing 10 feet away and looking directly at the spot where she had been, you would have seen nothing. A man came out. He was wearing different clothes now. Still plain, still without the markers of rank that the Crestfall wolves would have recognized, but clean. Dark fabric, well-made in the way that well-made things are distinguishable from merely functional things to anyone who looks closely enough. He was taller in the open air than he had seemed in the alley, which did not make sense geometrically, but was nonetheless her experience of him. He moved with the same quality of motion she had registered in the alley, not rushed, not cautious, simply directed, as though the space between where he was and where he was going was a formality he was willing to observe, but did not particularly require. He walked to the edge of the building and stopped. He looked out at the compound for a moment. Then he said, without turning around, in a voice that was not loud, but carried with the ease of someone accustomed to being heard without raising it, "You've been following the scent for 20 minutes. She did not move. He turned then and looked directly at the shadow where she was standing, and she understood with a cold, clarifying certainty that he had known she was there, probably before she got close to the building, possibly from the moment she picked up his trail, and that the thing she had taken for concealment had been something he had simply chosen not to interrupt. "You found the ring," he said. It was not a question. She stepped out of the shadow because there was no point remaining in it. She looked at him across the 10 feet of space between them, and she thought about every piece of information she had been assembling since the alley, and she thought about the sealed announcement and the senior betas with their lowered voices and the crown pressed into the inner band of a ring that a beggar had left on the ground. "Who are you?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Not tonight," he said. She felt the pull of the bond she had been trying not to think about. She felt it in the way of something that does not ask permission, and does not wait for the right moment, and does not particularly care whether the circumstances are convenient. He was standing 10 feet away, and the pull was there, and it had been there in the alley, and it had been there every time the scent from the ring reached her, and it was not going to stop being there simply because the timing was wrong and the context was incomprehensible, and she had no framework for any of this. She said, "The delegation arrived last night." He said nothing. She said, without announcement, without the formal entrance the pack had been preparing for. He said nothing. She said, "The Alpha was notified privately." He still said nothing. But there was something in his face. An adjustment. The faintest acknowledgement of something. She said, "An Alpha level sent on a ring that shouldn't be in this territory at all." She reached into her pocket, and she held it out across the 10 feet between them, and the moonlight caught it, and the crown on the inner band was visible from where he stood. He looked at the ring for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Go to sleep," he said. "You're safe tonight." "From Damon Vark," she said. "From everything," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that was not a comfort. It was a statement of fact from a person for whom the management of safety was not a hope but a function, a thing that could be applied or removed with the same neutrality as any other administrative decision. She stared at him. He went back inside. She stood in the dark with the ring in her palm, and the bond pulling at her ribs and the compound sleeping around her, and she thought about what he had just said. The particular way he had said it. The certainty of it. The complete and utter absence of any doubt in his voice. From everything. As though everything was a small and manageable inventory of concerns for him. As though the word everything, which for Lyra Voss had always been an enormous and largely hostile category, was for this man simply a list of items he had already handled. She put the ring back in her pocket and went back to her quarters. She lay on her narrow bed. She did not sleep. By the time the compound woke the next morning, Lyra had been awake for nearly 2 full days, and her mind was running with the particular sharp, reckless clarity that comes from exhaustion passing through itself and arriving somewhere on the other side. She completed her morning tasks. She stayed out of Damon Vark's path with the experienced precision of someone who had spent years mapping the movement patterns of people who meant her harm. She watched the north building from whatever distance her tasks placed her at throughout the day. She did not see him. What she did see, in the mid-afternoon, was something that stopped her where she stood and required her to keep her face completely still while her mind recalibrated everything she thought she was looking at. The pack's senior elder, a wolf named Carver who had been in the Crestfall Pack for longer than the Alpha had been alive, who held no formal rank but commanded a deference from every wolf in the compound that exceeded that of most betas, was walking across the central grounds. He was walking with someone. Beside him, not behind him. Side by side, the way you walk with someone whose authority matches or exceeds your own. The someone was wearing simple dark clothing and moving with a quality of ease that she recognized immediately. She was too far away to hear them. She watched them cross the grounds together, and she watched the senior elder gesture toward one of the main buildings, and she watched the man beside him nod, and she watched the senior elder's posture, and the senior elder's posture said everything that the distance and the silence could not say. It said, "I am in the presence of someone whose authority I recognize completely." It said, "I am not leading this conversation." It said, "I am reporting." They reached the door of the building and the senior elder opened it and held it and the man walked through first and the elder followed. Lyra stood where she was for a very long moment. She went back to her tasks. Her mind did not stop running. That evening, she was in the corridor outside the main gathering room when she heard the elder's voice from inside. She was moving past, she was not stopping, but the words came through the door at a volume slightly above what the elder had intended, and they reached her the way the important things always reached her. 2 words. "My king." She kept walking. She turned the corner. She stopped. She pressed her back against the wall, and she stood there, and she thought about a man in a filthy alley who had not stood up when a dominant beta appeared 10 feet away from him. She thought about a ring with a crown on the inside of its band. She thought about from everything, said with the certainty of someone for whom everything is a list of already resolved concerns. She thought about a kiss in the rain that had lasted 3 seconds and had been, on her side of it, entirely about survival and nothing else, and had been, on his side of it, something she had not yet found the right question to ask about. The Alpha King. The highest authority in the known wolf territories. Not a pack alpha. Not a regional alpha. The king. The one to whom all alphas answered. The one whose existence was more concept than person to most wolves who would never be in the same territory as him. The one whose name was invoked in the way that the names of the powerful are invoked, with a kind of reflexive gravity, when the situation required the largest available reference point. He had been sitting in a filthy alley in the rain. He had let her kiss him. He had smiled at Damonvark. He had told her she was safe from everything. And he had known she was there before she made a sound. She stood against the wall for another moment. Then she straightened up and she walked with great deliberateness toward the north building, and she did not talk herself out of it, and she did not slow down, and she arrived at the door and she knocked. Silence. She knocked again. The door opened. He was standing in it. Still in the plain dark clothing. Still wearing the expression she could not read, which was the expression of someone who has thought about every possible version of this moment and is simply observing which one arrived. She said, "You're the Alpha King." He said, "Yes." She said, "You've been here for days." In disguise. He said, "Yes." She said, "And you sat in that alley and you watched everything and you said nothing." He said, "I needed to see the pack as it actually was. Not as it presents itself to formal inspections." She looked at him for a long moment. The bond was there. It was always there now, had been there since the alley, had been building with the slow and completely unbothered momentum of something that does not negotiate. She said, "You knew. When I kissed you. You already knew." He looked at her, and the amber in his eyes was clear in the light from inside the room, and he said, "I knew before that." She felt the words land. She said, "That's why you were in the alley." He did not answer immediately. The silence had a specific quality to it, the quality of a confirmation that is allowing itself to be inferred rather than stated, which was its own kind of answer. She said, "How long have you known?" He said, "Long enough to come myself instead of sending someone else." She thought about that. The Alpha King, who had an entire apparatus of authority available to him, who could have sent any representative he chose, who could have arrived formally with full ceremony and the protective weight of his title visible and declared. Instead, sitting alone in a filthy alley in torn clothes in the rain on the edge of a mid-tier pack's territory. Waiting, she said, for me. He said, for you. The compound was quiet around them, and the night air was cool, and she was standing at the door of a building she was not supposed to be at, looking at a man she was not supposed to know about. Feeling the bond between them with a clarity that had nothing to do with rank or permission, or the architecture of a world that had spent 20 years telling her she did not qualify for good things. She said, I'm an Omega. He said, I know what you are. She said, Damon Vark publicly rejected me 6 days ago in front of the entire pack. He said, I know that too. She said, and you're the Alpha King. He said, you keep saying that. She said, I keep saying it because I'm trying to understand why it doesn't seem to be creating the problem for you that it should be creating. He looked at her for a moment and something shifted in his expression. It was small, barely visible. But it was the first thing she had seen in his face that was not calibrated, the first thing that had arrived without being managed. It was there for a second and then it was gone. He said, because it isn't a problem. She stood at the door of that building for another moment. The bond was pulling. The ring was in her pocket. The 2 words from the corridor were still in her ears. Her whole life was in the balance in every direction she could look, and she had not slept in 2 days, and she was 20 years old, and she was standing in front of the Alpha King in the middle of the night because she had run into a dead-end alley and kissed a stranger. And the stranger had turned out to be the answer to a question she had not known she was asking. She said, this isn't over. He said, no. She said, I need to think. He said, you know where I am. She turned and she walked back across the compound, and she did not look back, and she kept her pace even and her shoulders level and her face giving nothing away to the dark and the empty grounds around her. And when she reached her quarters and closed the door, she stood with her back against it and let out the breath she had been holding since he said for you, and her hands were steady and her eyes were dry, and she stood there until the steadiness stopped being something she was producing by effort and started being something that was simply true. In the morning, Damon Vark came for her. He came early, before the compound was fully active, with the timing of someone who had calculated that early arrival reduced the possibility of interference. He came with another beta, not as a witness, but as a physical addition to the weight of his authority, and he came to her quarters and opened the door without knocking and told her it was time. She looked at him from across the room. She said, I won't be doing that. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that a room produces when the thing that has just been said is so far outside the expected parameters of the conversation that the room itself needs a moment to recalibrate. Damon Vark's face did a series of things in rapid succession, moving from surprise through the specific kind of anger that comes not from the fact of a refusal, but from the identity of the person doing the refusing, arriving finally at something cold and determined. He said she did not have a choice. She said she was aware that he believed that. He stepped into the room. The other beta stepped in behind him. And then a third presence arrived in the doorway. Not loud. Not dramatic. Not preceded by any sound that announced itself. Simply present, in the way that the most consequential things are often simply present, without the theatrical preparation that lesser things require. The man in the doorway was dressed plainly. Dark fabric, clean, no insignia, no formal markers of rank. But every wolf in that room felt it. The beta who had come with Damon went very still with the instinctive, involuntary stillness of a body that has just recognized something at a level below conscious thought and is waiting for the conscious mind to catch up. Damon turned. The amber eyes were steady. The smile was not the smile from the alley. It was quieter than that. More final. Damon Vark was a beta of the Crestfall Pack, third in authority within his hierarchy, accustomed to a world in which his rank placed him above almost everyone he would encounter in a given day. He had spent his life inside that fact and had built his understanding of himself around it and had made decisions, many decisions, the kind that accumulate into a character, based on the certainty that his authority was near the top of the available scale. He had never been in a room with someone whose authority made his look like a footnote. He understood now. The understanding moved across his face in real time. The man in the doorway said, "Leave." One word. Damon Vark left. The other beta left. The door closed. Lyra stood in the center of her small room in her quarters at the edge of the compound and looked at the man who had just cleared her room with a single word, and she thought about everything that had happened in the 8 days since the mate ceremony, and she thought about the particular quality of silence that a room has after a long-held tension is removed from it, and she thought about from everything, and she thought about for you, and she thought about the ring in her pocket and the crown on its band. He looked at her. He said, "You don't have to stay here." She said, "I know." He said, "There are things I need to tell you." She said, "I know that too." He said, "It's more complicated than the rank issue." She said, "I had a feeling." He moved into the room, and he stopped in front of her, and the bond between them was at full presence now. Not a pull anymore, but a fact, the way gravity is a fact, simply a condition of being in proximity to the thing you were made to be in proximity to. She felt it in her chest, and in her hands, and in the part of her that had spent 20 years being told it did not qualify. He said, "Your bloodline." She said, "What about it?" He said, "It's not what the pack record says it is." She looked at him. He said, "You were registered as Omega from birth. But that registration was made by someone who had a reason to make it. Someone who needed you to be invisible. Someone who understood that if the truth of your bloodline was known, you would not have been safe here." She said, "What is my bloodline?" He said, "The last of the original founding line of the Northern Territories. The line that predates every pack, every alpha designation, every hierarchy that exists in this region. The line that, under the oldest law of the Wolf Kingdom, carries a claim to authority that supersedes the current structure." She heard the words. She held them in the silence of her small room at the edge of the compound where she had lived for 12 years at the bottom of everything. She said, "That's why you came yourself." He said, "That's one reason." She said, "And the other." He looked at her with the amber eyes that had been calm in the alley and calm in the rain and calm in every moment she had seen him, and he said, "You already know the other reason." The bond answered her before she could speak. She stood in the room that was about to stop being her room and looked at the Alpha King who had sat in a filthy alley in the rain to find her, and she understood that the 10 seconds she had been asking for had turned into something she did not yet have the full language for, and probably would not for a long time. Outside the compound, beyond the walls of a world that had spent 20 years telling her she was at the bottom of it, the morning was happening. Birds. Light. The ordinary continuation of a world that was about to find out it needed to make room. She said, "What happens now?" He said, "Now we do this correctly." She said, "And Damon Vark." He said, "He'll face a formal review for his conduct. The betas he corrupted along with him. The pack structure in Crestfall has been my concern for longer than this visit." That part was already in motion. She said, "And me." He looked at her. He said, "You stand where you were always supposed to stand. Next to me." She looked at him for a long moment. The room was quiet. The compound outside was waking up. Somewhere in the north building there were advisors who were probably trying to locate their king and trying to do so without making it obvious that he was not where he was supposed to be. Somewhere in the compound, Damon Vark was adjusting his understanding of the morning he had expected to have. Somewhere in the pack's records, her registration was a lie that someone had written down 20 years ago and believed would never be questioned. A lot of things were about to be questioned. She reached into her pocket and she held out the ring. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. Then he took it from her palm, and he turned it once, and he looked at the crown on the inside of the band, and he put it in his own pocket, and the transaction of it was so quiet and so complete that it felt like the closing of something that had been open for a very long time. She said, "I have conditions." He said, "I expected you would." She said, "The Omegas in this pack. Every pack in the Northern Territories. The rank system as it's currently structured." He said, "Continue." She said, "It needs to change. Not as a favor. As policy. Formal, binding, enforced policy with consequences for violation. He looked at her with something that was not surprise, and was not amusement, and was not the patronizing acknowledgement of someone who is filing a request away for later, and has no intention of honoring it. It was the look of someone who is listening and has decided that what they are hearing is worth the full weight of their attention. He said, "That was already on my list." She said, "Then we have a starting point." Outside the compound, beyond the Crestfall Pack's walls and its hierarchy and its records, and its carefully maintained structure of who stood where and who mattered how much, the Northern Territories stretched in every direction. Hundreds of packs. Thousands of wolves. A system old enough to have calcified around its own injustices and powerful enough to have made those injustices feel inevitable. Inside a small room at the edge of one of those packs, a woman who had been registered as the lowest rank from birth was standing in front of the highest authority in the region and telling him what needed to change. He was writing it down. Not literally, but in the way that the most important agreements are written, in the quality of attention between two people who are deciding what the future is going to look like and taking the decision seriously. This was not the end of the story. It was not even close to the end. There were challenges ahead that neither of them fully understood yet. There were forces in the Northern Territories that had built their power on the existing structure and would not accept its revision without resistance. There was the matter of Kale's brother, whose name had not yet entered this narrative but would soon, in a way that would reframe several things that currently seemed settled. There was the question of Lyra's bloodline and the person who had falsified her registration and the reason behind it and what that reason meant for the history she thought she knew. There was the formal sealing of the bond, which had its own politics and its own timeline and its own set of people with opinions about it. There was a great deal of work ahead. But on this particular morning, in this particular room, the immediate thing was simple. Lyra Voss, last of the original founding line of the Northern Territories, registered Omega for 20 years by someone who needed her to be invisible, was visible. And the person standing in front of her had come a very long way, alone, in the rain, in torn clothing, and had sat in a filthy alley and waited, specifically so that she would be. This was only the beginning. If this story reached you, if it held you from the first second to this one, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to this channel, share this video with someone who needs a story that does not end where it's expected to, leave a comment below telling us the moment you knew this was not the story you thought it was. Your support is what makes the next chapter possible, and there is a next chapter, and it is coming, and what is in it will reframe everything you just watched. We will see you there.